Awesome. Cool. Thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Sweet. Well, it's just after 8, so we'll get going. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us as well. Tonight, we have a really special guest, Richard French. Richard, for anyone who may not be familiar, runs Slipstream Angling, which is a travel company based in Toronto. It specializes in fly fishing adventures across the globe. How many locations do you offer through your services?
I would say it's about 45 countries and around 175 destinations.
It's quite the list.
It's a lot. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, and anyone who has had the experience of traveling with drift outfitters in the past has used Richard, knowingly or not. Although everyone certainly would know Richard, because I think we've met, done meet and greets with you every time that we've done those. But yeah, we work with Richard a lot in the shop, and for our own personal travel as well. Whenever Rob or myself, we do trips, especially to the area that we're talking tonight about, but also in general, we definitely look toward Richard as a great asset that we have here very locally. Richard's based out of Toronto, and he has more experience in this area than just about anyone out there, really. So pleasure to have you, Richard. And remind me, how long you been at this now?
I started in 1999 outfitting in Belize, and then I moved to Cuba in 2006, and then I went global in 2008. So it's over 20 years of working in the Caribbean for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think if I remember right, did you lived down south for a while getting this started, right?
Yes, sir. I lived in Belize for 10 years. I lived in Mexico for 2 years. And I lived for 18 months in Havana, Cuba. So, of the 4 countries I'm going to be talking about today, I've lived in 3 of them.
That's awesome. Very, very cool. All right, so we'll run this the same way that we've run past talks on here for anyone who's joined us, and that is that Richard's going to talk a little bit about the area and some of the experiences and opportunities available, and we'd encourage you to get in on the fun as well. If you have questions, if you haven't experienced this kind of fishing before and want to know more about the area or anything about these fish or whatever it may be, feel free to join in. We just ask that you use the chat function on Zoom. So just as opposed to turning your microphone on, use the chat function so we don't get any messy audio. And we'll answer your questions as we go. So with that, Richard, do you want to kind of take us away and do your thing?
Thank you. I appreciate it, Chris. Good evening, folks. It's a pleasure to meet you. Some of you may know me, some of you don't. But as we talked with Chris just briefly a minute ago, I've been doing this a long time, over 20 years in the Caribbean, and I've got a really good handle on it. And it's a pretty special place. The area is, I think, because it's in our backyard and is so easy to get to, we tend to take it for granted sometimes. I mean, as I said to Chris earlier, I've got clients from Japan and New Zealand and Australia who fly every year to come to the Caribbean to fish. So it's so easy for us to get there, and I'm going to talk about that. And because the Caribbean is such a large place, really, I'm going to talk about 4 main countries for fly fishing within the Caribbean. And there are some other places that I'm not going to really get into, like Turks and Caicos is a very good bone fishery. On the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica and Nicaragua, there's some very good tarpon fishing. But, this is a fairly comprehensive subject that I'm going to go over. And obviously, I've got limited amounts of time. So I'm just going to stick with the 4 main countries that are fairly well known for fly fishing in saltwater in the Caribbean. You've got the Bahamas, phenomenal country. I love it. This is the one country I have not lived in, but I've got over 100 days of water on the water in the Bahamas. So I know the islands, the outer islands. I know the country really well. And it's a terrific fishery. You've got Belize, where I lived for a decade. And that's just below Mexico on the Caribbean coast. You've got Cuba, which is probably my favorite place to fish in the Caribbean. And you've got Mexico. And Mexico is a terrific spot. Mexico has all the species. I like Mexico a lot, and it's a pretty fun experience. I like Mexico. So if you're looking at a trip to the Caribbean, you got to think about, okay, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Because you've got a lot of options. I mean, within the 4 countries that I just mentioned, there's probably close to 70 fishing lodges in those 4 countries. So it can be a little overwhelming, and that's kind of where I am of value, because I've been to all these places. I travel to fish for a living. I'm very lucky, but I travel a lot. So you got to think about weather and seasons in the Caribbean, and that's a really important factor in any decision you make. The fall and winter months can be really good, but you can also have cold fronts drop down from the United States, which will bugger up your fishing completely, and it can potentially like cut your week in half. You may have great weather, but I've been stuck in the Bahamas and in Mexico and Cuba where, it's blowing 40 miles an hour and it's overcast and you're not able to flats fish at all in those conditions, and there's nothing you can do. So you really need to think about when you can go. Obviously, a winter vacation is optimal for us folks that live in the northern climates. I get out of here every chance I get in the wintertime, and I just take the chance with the weather and hope it's good down there, wherever it is that I'm going. But you just never know. So fall and winter, you can get cold fronts. So you got to keep that in mind. That's an important factor to consider. The spring is pretty generally nice. I like the spring. Usually it's sunny, warm, and you've got, a little bit of wind here and there. Summer months are really hot, and the hurricane season is August through October. I don't recommend traveling in the Caribbean at that point in time. Next, you got to ask yourself about the species priorities for the trip. What are you interested in catching? Because that's really going to dictate where you go. And that's a key factor in any decision you make. Because while the Caribbean is an area, each of the countries has its own strengths and weaknesses in terms of species. And you need to be aware of that. The next thing you got to factor in is your budget and what your budget for the trip is going to be. That too is going to dictate where you are going to go. There's a huge variety of options and choices you have, from a low end to very high end. And it's up to you what you can spend. And we pretty much have something for everybody. But budget is a key factor in any consideration for a trip that you're going to do to the Caribbean. So basically, within the Caribbean, you've got 2 main seasons for fishing. And usually the lodges break it down this way. You've got a low season, which is July through about early February. Usually this is a less expensive time to travel because of the weather potentially. And also the spring and early summer is where you get most demand for fishing lodges. So low season generally starts early summer and lasts until about the end of January. Then you've got high season. High season is usually where the most demand is and where the prices are generally more expensive. Now, some lodges throughout the Caribbean just have one price, but I would say by far the majority have a high season price that's going to be more expensive because the demand to get in to fish these areas and these properties is much higher. And that really starts in about mid-February and will run, depending on the location and the country, will run until Cuba will go into mid-July. The Bahamas usually late June, Belize probably late June too, and Mexico the end of July in most lodge cases. So I want to talk to you a bit about species availability because that's a really important consideration in anywhere you go. And the 4 countries that I talked about all have different varieties, and that's really important. So the Bahamas, strictly a bonefish destination, and that's really important. There are some permit and some tarpon found in the Bahamas. I've caught tarpon on the west side of Andros. I've got over 100 days of water on the water in the Bahamas. I've never caught a permit there. I've seen about 5. That's in 100 days. So if you do a trip to the Bahamas, it's really for bonefish, and it's a superb bone fishery. It bills itself as the bonefish capital of the world for a reason. So really, you need to be thinking about the Bahamas as a dedicated bonefish trip. You can target things like jacks and barracudas, which I love to fish for, but it's not a place where you can bank on finding permit or tarpon. That's just the reality of the Bahamas. So the Bahamas is a bonefish fishery first and foremost. And if you do see any of the other species like a tarpon or a permit, that's just a bonus. But you can't really go there expecting to see one. And I don't care where you go in the Bahamas, that's true.
And
yeah,
sorry
sorry.
to interrupt, Richard. Is it correct? My understanding of kind of the reasoning behind that is access to deep water. Is that what you'd say is a part of that sort of species?
I think in the end, it's just, I have no good reason for it. Usually it has something to do with food source, but to me, I've got amazing flats in the Bahamas that you would think hold permit, and you never see them. So I just simply don't have an answer for it. The flat structure is the same. The marl bottom is very similar. The food source is the same. That would be a good question for the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, but I bet you they don't even know.
Fair enough.
So if you're looking at alternative species, if you want something more than simply just a bonefish trip, Belize has a very good mixed bag of species. It's got bonefish, it's got permit, it's got tarpon. And you've got Cuba, all 4 species. You've got bonefish, tarpon, permit, and snook. Cuba is a great fishery. And Mexico, too, has multi-species. Bonefish, permit, snook, and tarpon. So if you're interested in a good mixed bag species, you're going to be looking at Mexico, Belize, or Cuba.
And is there anything that you're sacrificing by going to a multi-species destination that you wouldn't get at a place like the Bahamas? Is it waiting opportunity or?
Yes. In some cases, yes. And I'll get into that as we go along.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the Bahamas and just give you a little overview of it because I love this place. It's a really unique experience. The culture of the Bahamas is really terrific. It's really comprised of 7 groups of main islands that you can fish. And each of these island groupings, these 7 island groupings, is almost like a country unto itself. While they're Bahamian, they have their own way of doing things, their own customs that are very much island centric. So if you look at a place like South Andros, the vibe is very different than if you were to go to somewhere like the Exumas or Grand Bahama Island, which also both have very good bone fishing. So the Bahamians have always claimed to be the bonefish capital of the world, and in a lot of respects, it's hard to argue because they really have superb bone fishing almost everywhere in the country. What I like about the Bahamas, especially from Canada and on the east coast of the U.S., is you've got direct flights just from just about everywhere in North America. So it's really easy to get into. Andros, Grand Bahama, the Exumas, Abaco, the Berry Islands, Long Key, Crooked and Acklands, and Eleuthera all have good fishing lodges on them. So, the choice within the Bahamas is really very vast. For a lot of the clients and the trips that they go to within the Bahamas, you're generally flying into Nassau and then getting a domestic flight to the outer islands. However, there are some places like Georgetown and the Exumas that has a direct Air Canada flight, and also Freeport on Grand Bahama Island also has a direct flight from Toronto. So you don't necessarily have to go into Nassau, but for a lot of the places like getting into Andros and getting further south into places like Crooked and Acklands, you have to go in and out through Nassau, and normally overnight on your way in. The one caveat I would say is that Air Bahamas, that does a lot of the domestic flights, notoriously late, and so I've missed a lot of connecting flights back to Toronto because of Air Bahamas, and by a lot I mean at least 5 times that's happened to me. But each of the islands that's there has a really friendly, easygoing culture to it. There's just a very light vibe to the Bahamas that I really like and I'm attracted to. It's just friendly. The people are happy to have you. They love tourism. If they're not working in tourism, a member of their family is. So it's a critical component. And bone fishing brings in hundreds of millions of dollars into the local Bahamian economy every year. So, the guides are really well respected there. And you as a bone fisherman are always welcome in the Bahamas. I like the Bahamas as a first saltwater trip. It allows you to sort of get an experience to fish for bonefish without worrying about trying to target the harder, more difficult species like permit and tarpon. The size of the bonefish is really good. In the Bahamas, most of the bottom is a fairly soft marl with limited wading opportunities. But there are places like parts of the Exumas and like the very end of southern Andros that have very good wading. But I would say overall, the majority of the bone fishing in the Bahamas, you're going to be doing it from the skiff. Average size fish in the Bahamas is about 3 to 5 pounds. But the beauty of the Bahamas is the bigger fish. If you were to fish the Bahamas for a week in most of the destinations within the country, you're going to see 8, 9, and maybe 10-pound plus bonefish. You may not catch them, but you'll see them because the Bahamas has just a really nice, healthy, average size bonefish. And that's a wonderful thing in my books. Next up, just quickly, Belize. This is a country I know really well. I lived there for 10 years. Belize is really unique in a lot of respects, and it's a terrific fishery. It's easy to get to. You've got direct flights from Toronto and from the east coast of the US. From Toronto, it's less than 5 hours. And you can get flights through Miami, Houston, Charlotte, Atlanta. A nice thing about Belize is English is the spoken language there, so there's no language barriers. It's a small country. It only has about 350,000 people in it. And because it's small, it's easy to get around. And you can do 2 or more destinations within Belize. Like you can fish 2 separate areas with different guide networks, all within the same week. Simply because it's, you can be on a half-hour flight within Belize to fly from one city or town to the next. And then you're in a completely different fishery and a completely different environment. I like that a lot because I like to travel. I like to see different places. And Belize is really easy to get around in. Northern Belize in the spring is really good for sight casting to tarpon. They have some flats on the in between Ambergris Key and the mainland called the Savannah Flats, which are very unique and only found in that part of northern Belize. And you'll be sight casting in like gin clear water to 80 to 100-pound cruising tarpon. The only other places where you can do that are the Florida Keys, which are exceedingly busy and hard to get good guides, and also on the south and north coasts of Cuba. So there's not a lot of places where you can sight cast to tarpon. But that part of Belize between Ambergris Caye and the mainland is one of the best places in the world for it. What I love about Belize is southern Belize. And the permit fishing in this part of the world is superb. I just love it. That's where I cut my teeth. At one point, I only fished for permit for 5 straight years. I just went crazy. I was fascinated by them. I lost my mind basically. And it took me a good 5 years before I was interested in bone fishing or tarpon fishing. That's how good the fishery is down there. Now,
Remind me, Richard, what's your permit count up to now?
50.
There you go. There's probably not many people that can say that.
Well, that may be so, but I'm laughing simply because I landed my 50th 6 years ago. I haven't caught one since. And it's not for lack of opportunity or chances, because I've spent a lot of time trying. It's a cruel, permit fishing is a cruel addiction. And if there's anyone out there that's watching this that fishes for them, you'll know exactly what I mean. It's hard to fathom sometimes, but it's addictive, and it's fantastic. I love it. So Belize is unique because it's got a barrier reef that runs down the entire country, and inside the reef, you've got a huge variety of flats to fish. But outside the reef, the main reef, they've got 3 separate atolls. And those atolls are really unique. They're coral formed, coral based, out in the middle of nowhere. And Turnef Atoll is the largest and most famous of the 3 atolls. And on Turnef Atoll, there are 2 very good bonefish lodges that offer good permit fishing and very big tarpon in the summer as well. This is a really pristine environment. You take a boat from Belize City. It's about a 90-minute boat ride out in a big cabin cruiser. And when you get there, it's like you're in paradise. It's lovely. And it's very different from the flats that you'll find on the inner side of the reef throughout the country. So Belize is unique. It's small, but it has probably, I would say, 4 to 5 very distinct fisheries within it that are completely different from each other. And where you go in Belize should depend on what you're most interested in fishing for. So I love southern Belize, and I lived there for 8 years until a hurricane blew my house away. And that hit in October of 2000, and I can't even remember what year it was. But southern Belize is spectacular because it's just all about permit fishing. And there are tarpon. There are very few bonefish in southern Belize, as opposed to northern Belize, where there's a lot of bonefish. So again, where you go and where you should go to fish really depends on what you're interested in fishing for when you go to Belize. Southern Belize is unique because it's the only place I know of in the world where you can consistently fish for permit in very skinny water to tailing permit. That's very unique, and you can do it every day during the course of your week, where you'll be out of the boat, you'll start wading, and you'll be casting to tailing permit in anywhere from 2 to 3 feet of water. It's really hard. It's the most challenging fly fishing I know of, but it's incredibly addictive and so rewarding. So if there's any permit fans out there and you've not been to southern Belize to fish, it's got to be on your list. I love it, and I spent a lot of time there over the years. Next up in terms of Caribbean countries are going to be Mexico, and specifically the states of Quintana Roo, the Yucatan, and Campeche. Now, if you look at this map I've got in front of you, there's no cities or anything on it. It's just the geographic bottom line. So if you go to the right-hand side and go all the way down, you'll see 2 large bays on the right-hand side. The furthest bay down is called Espiritu Santo Bay. That, to me, is the best fishery in the country for for a Grand Slam and a Super Slam. It's got everything. But it's difficult to get in there because it's so remote. There are only 2 lodges that work that property, and both of them are very difficult to get into. They're booked out so far in advance. I hold some weeks. I hold a week in November there, and I've got 3 skiffs for a specific week in November that I've had for 8 years. And I keep trying to get another boat every year, and I haven't gotten one. They're just, they allow you to rebook once you've been, and if you do, then the space is yours until you tell them you don't want it. It's a terrific fishery, certainly the best in the country. Right above it, you'll see the larger of the 2 bays. That is Ascension Bay, which is probably the most famous flats fishery in Mexico. Ascension Bay is fantastic. I love it. It's got everything. It's got permit, tarpon, bonefish, snook. This is one thing about this area is the snook fishing in this part of the world is very good. And from a fly fishing perspective, next to probably the Florida Everglades, I'd say it's the best snook fishery I know of. I like this area a lot. It's a terrific flats fishery. The lodges that operate out of Ascension Bay, the larger of the 2 bays, there's probably about 7 of them. And it can get busy down there, but more often than not, you might see 1 or 2 boats during the day, but it's not too bad. If you go up from there and you get to the top of the map I'm showing you, you'll see a little peninsula with an island that sticks out of it. That island is called Holbox. And I fish Holbox, if not every year, every other year for giant tarpon. There's no permit there. There's no bonefish there. What there is there is a highway of giant tarpon that are migrating up to the Keys. And they pass through there every summer, starting in about July, late June, and they fish. You fish there for July and August, sometimes into early September. You're only fishing big tarpon. It's a very cool experience. It's not for everybody, but because I'm talking about Mexico, I think I need to point out Holbox because it is an important fishery. Now, if you go further to the left and then start going down toward on the other side of the peninsula, you'll find Campeche. And while that's not technically a Caribbean fishery anymore, or ever was, it's really a Gulf Coast fishery now. That area is a juvenile tarpon fishery. There's no big tarpon there. What you have is just an enormous mangrove estuary that's a national park. And the juvenile tarpon will be born in this mangrove estuary, and they'll live there till they're about 25 or 30 pounds, and then they go offshore. So you're fishing juvenile tarpon, you're sight casting to them. That's all you're fishing. You might see some snook. My friend Raul owns a very good operation there, so I felt obligated to mention it because it too is an important fishery in Mexico. Just juvenile tarpon, but a great trip. That's a lot of fun. And I recommend a good juvenile tarpon trip. If you're interested in tarpon and you haven't caught any, before you start fishing for big fish, the juvenile tarpon trip is a really good experience because it shows you how tarpon eat. You'll lose a lot of them. You'll catch a lot of them. But it'll teach you how to fight the fish, how they run, how they jump, what to do when they jump. And I always say it's better to learn on a small fish than to learn on a 180-pound tarpon. But that's just me.
And do you have any experience with like Cozumel or Isla Blanca?
Yes, I know Isla Blanca quite well, and I didn't talk about it because it's only serviced by a few guides. Generally, Isla Blanca, it's a nice fishery, but my issue with it is all the species you're going to find there, and they have them all, bonefish, permit, tarpon, and snook, generally all very small fish. You're not catching anything of size there at all. And so for me, I've got better fisheries that I'd rather access that give me better chances at larger fish. Have you fished Isla, Chris?
No, I haven't. Just curious.
Yep,
But
it's
as Ascension, I have, and
yeah,
fantastic fisher for sure.
yeah. It's
Yeah,
Isla Blanca is interesting, but you're basically staying in Cancun. It's worthwhile for a day or two, but
yeah,
that's not a place I'd ever send anybody for a week. That's for sure.
yep. It's great
And
insight.
Cozumel too. Cozumel has a small bonefish population. It has one or two guides that fish them, but again, that's a day trip, maybe two, but no
Yep,
more than that. So the
that makes
places that
sense.
I'm talking about are places that you can go for a week and do a proper lodge fishing experience, um, where you're going to be fishing new water every day. And I
Hmm.
think that's really important.
Yeah.
So what I like about Mexico is easy in and out flights through Cancun. It doesn't matter where you live, where you're watching this presentation from. It's easy to get to Mexico because every city has flights to Cancun daily. And that's a huge plus. You can get directs from pretty much anywhere in North America to Cancun on a daily basis. So I like this area a lot. I fish it because I like a variety of species. And this part of Mexico has all four species. And there's some really good lodges that fish Ascension Bay and as well as Espiritu Santo Bay below. Um, what I like about Ascension Bay, and the reason why I like to support it, is it's become a national park that's called the San Can Biosphere. And what they did is about 20 years ago, they bought out all the commercial fishing licenses and turned it into a sport fishing area. So the only commercial fishing that is allowed to happen inside Ascension Bay now is lobster fishing and sponge fishing. So those don't impact the flats at all. So the fishery is actually better now than it was 20 years ago. And in this day and age, I'm all about supporting that kind of a mentality. Now, the Mexicans were really smart, forward thinking about establishing the park. And as a result, they've got a really good fishery that supports a huge population of guides, people that work in the lodges. It just brings a lot of benefit to the communities without taking very much, if anything, out. And again, I'm a big believer in that kind of mentality. So I like supporting it every chance I get. The other thing I like about this area is that it's a really good place to target snook. To me, snook are a really undervalued sport fish. Not a lot of people fish for them, but I've kind of got the snook bug these days. And Ascension Bay and Espiritu Santo Bay below it are, to me, the two best snook fisheries that I know of in the Caribbean.
And would you say I'm thinking it's a great point you mentioned about Siacan being a biosphere or a national park. I'm thinking as well, like Cuba. I'm sure you'll touch on how protected those fisheries are, and I think Andros has a large national park. Um, Belize, I think you're saying, has some protection. I know that's not the case in some of the other smaller fisheries. So is that a big consideration for you in choosing your destinations as well?
In some regards, yes. I'm always looking for uh, situations that where you're going to where the environment's going to benefit, because I'm a big believer when I send guests somewhere, I don't want you taking anything out but good memories and good experiences. The environments need to be kept intact, and I want to support them everywhere I can. And so when you've got a forward-thinking government that actually plans to do something and does it, I want to get behind that every chance I get, because, and I will touch on the fisheries in Cuba, where the fisheries there are better now than they were 25 years ago because of the fact that areas have been protected. So that's a win-win. So I'm all about supporting that every chance I get. So I mentioned the Yucatan and Holbox, dedicated tarpon fishery, big tarpon fishery, a lot of fun. I would recommend Holbox for experienced anglers with at least 3 or 4 trips under their belt. And by trips, I mean saltwater trips, where you want to then go to the next level and start targeting big tarpon. That's what Holbox is all about. And again, Campeche, just juvenile tarpon, but a really good way to learn about tarpon, and a lot of fun and lots of action throughout the day. And Campeche is a pretty cool little town too, which is nice. So now we get into Cuba, which is probably my favorite place to fish in the Caribbean for a wide variety of reasons that I'll get into. I lived in Havana for 18 months. I have fished all of Cuba from top to bottom. I've done work for the Cuban government going into remote areas where they've asked me to assess the fishery, and whether or not it's viable for them to start promoting it and developing it as a fishery. I've had the good fortune to do that 3 times over the last 15 years. And so I know the Cuban fisheries really well, even the ones that nobody knows about because they just weren't viable. But it's a terrific fishery, and to me, it's the best in the Caribbean. I just love it. It's got everything, and I'll get into this. So you've really basically got 2 distinct areas. You've got the North Shore, which fishes Cayo Santa Maria, and you've got also Cayo Romano, which is further to the east of Cayo Santa Maria. Now, both of these areas have airports that have direct flights, so it's pretty easy in and out. I like that. And both those fisheries are really good. And then you've got the more famous fisheries on the south, which is the JDR and the Zapata. And both of those fisheries, you're either going through Havana or through Cayo Coco. Now, Havana is a very special place to me. A lot of people see it and get freaked out by it because it's falling apart, but it's a beautiful city. It's going through some really tough times right now, which I'll get into in a second. But when you do the South Coast fisheries, you're generally going to be flying through Havana and sometimes through Cayo Coco, which is on the North Shore. And you'll take a 3-hour bus ride down to the boats in Jucaro for fishing in the JDR. So what I like about Cuba is that the fisheries are by far the least pressured in all of the Caribbean. And of that, there's no debate. Because the way Cuba works is unlike anywhere else in the Caribbean. The government in Cuba runs all the fisheries in partnership with specific foreign companies. Now, there's no such thing as a freelance guide in Cuba. Like there's no guides in Cuba that have websites where you can just find them online and call them and book a couple of days. You can do that in Belize, Mexico, or the Bahamas if you didn't want to go and stay at a lodge. In Cuba, that's not an option because the government runs all the fisheries and controls them. So that means that you've got an incredible amount of just untouched areas that just are lightly fished compared to the rest of the Caribbean. Now, the government does a lot of bad things in Cuba, but one of the good things they do is they've set aside a lot of areas as national parks where you're not allowed to commercially fish because they see the value that sport fishing and fly fishing brings into these areas. And you know, the guiding there is, the guides in Cuba are total rock stars, and they are really lucky. They get to do jobs they love. They get to fish in the environments that, you know, I pay a lot of money to go into. Cuba itself has a lot of good things going for it. It's not the perfect location though, because there's a US embargo with Cuba, which has meant that you've got so much of the country in Cuba is breaking down. Their infrastructure is falling apart and they have no money to fix it. But from a strictly flats fishing perspective, Cuba is number 2 in the world. I would say the number one destination for saltwater is the Seychelles. Cuba is number two, and it's a hell of a lot closer and a lot less expensive. So we've got that right in our backyard. Cuba has some really good wading opportunities. There are certain places in the country where the wading's not strong, but by and large, if you want to wade and you like wading, Cuba is a very good place to fish. I didn't mention the wading in Mexico. It's similar to the Bahamas in that it's mostly a softer marl. There are some areas that are fairly hard packed sand in Mexico, but by and large, it's a soft marl, and more often than not, you're going to be fishing from the boat. In Belize, you've got more coral based as opposed to marl based bottoms, so you can do more wading in Belize, especially in southern Belize. But Cuba, to me, of all the countries, has the best wading options within the Caribbean. And there are certainly some areas where it's soft, but by and large, it's a firmer, more solid sand-based and coral-based flat structure. So, if you like to wade and get out of the boat for a couple hours a day, which I do, Cuba is probably your number one destination in the country to go. Our number one destination in the Caribbean, rather, to go with wading. So I want to talk a bit about guiding, because guiding varies so much in the Caribbean. And it's a really important aspect to any fishing trip. The Bahamas, for me, I would say that the average bonefish guide in the Bahamas is at a very high level. Basically, they only fish for bonefish. I mean, they'll be excited if they see a tarpon or a permit, but their specialty is bonefish, and by and large, they're really good at it. I've had the odd not great guide in Cuba, or rather in Bahamas, but mostly the guiding is excellent there. And that's a real strength of the country. In Belize, your average guiding, and I'm speaking generally to everybody out there. I would say the average, quality of guiding in Belize is good to excellent, especially in the south. To me, the Belizean guides in the south of the country are the cream of the crop, and it's not even close. There are some very good guides that work in the middle of the country and in the north of the country, but the southern Belize permit guides and guides in general down there are as good as I've seen anywhere. When we get into Cuba, the guiding there can be it's a complex issue, and I'm going to talk very honestly about it. There are two companies that run the fishing in Cuba. One of them is Avalon, and the other is a much smaller company that runs Salinas Zapata, which is where the drift shop is going next month. Now, Avalon has a monopoly on most of the best fisheries in Cuba, and they generally do a really good job. They certainly understand anglers, and they're very angler focused, which is great. The owners of the company, I know they all fish, so they understand what traveling anglers want and need. So they have a lot of guides that work throughout their fisheries, and I think they have 5 or 6 fisheries in the country. And the guides there in general are really good, but they're also very high strung, and they get frustrated easily. Not all of them, but I've met more Cuban guides that get frustrated in the way Keys guides do than I have anywhere else. And they get really excited, and they just want you to do well. So when they put you in front of a fish, and this happens to me, I blow fish all the time, and I've got a lot of experience, but I still make tons of mistakes. And I'll have a Cuban guide bark at me for missing the shot. I look at him and say, "I'm sorry, but I can't cast 50 feet into 30-mile-an-hour winds." So they can be a little testy sometimes, but really in the end, it's just because they want you to do well. Especially the more senior guides can be a little prickly if you blow a shot. But I always just, if I get too much attitude from a guide, I just look at him and say, dude, I'm on holidays. Shut the hell up. And usually that's the end of it. But it takes a lot to get me to that point. But it's happened to me in Cuba more than it has anywhere else, because I'm on holidays. I just want to have a fun time and relax. And if I miss a fish, well, I'll get the next one. And that's what I tell them. There'll be another one coming along. And if not, what can you do? So the Avalon guides are really good, but the Avalon guides, a lot of them have, especially the senior guides, have high expectations for you. And sometimes it's hard to meet those expectations. Now, before I get into Mexico, I want to also talk about the Zapata guides, because they are really unique and generally very good. Now, the Zapata has been going as a fishery for 20 plus years now. It's the first place I ever fished in Cuba, and I think it was 2000. I went there. They used to just have these little fiberglass skiffs that they had to pull you in. There were no engines. And it was mostly a bone fishery, but there were some tarpon and some permit around. So now they have brand new beaver tail skiffs, and the guiding in Salinas and in the Rio Hatuanico, which is the river you fish for tarpon there, is very good. They're pretty chill. They don't get on you, and that's really important to me. So I like Salinas for the guides. I've also known all the guides there, some of them for 20 years now, maybe longer. The one area that I would say where guiding can be tricky is in Mexico. And maybe hit or miss is not fair, but I've had my share of poor guides in Mexico over the years. One of the issues is definitely language. Certainly, they all speak, a broken fishing language. Some of the Mexican guides have very good English, but quite a few of them don't. They don't speak English, and at best, they have a sort of broken fishing English, and that could cause problems sometimes. It's mostly miscommunication, but over the course of a week, if you do a lot of miscommunication with your guide, it generally means you've not had a great week. And this is kind of where I really earn my money in my business, is because I know the guides at just about every property I deal with really well and have known them for a long time. So when I book you into a place, I'm 8 times out of 10, I'm asking for a specific guide availability, because at every lodge you go to, there's generally 4 or 5 of the better guides. And then you've also got 3 or 4 that are newer that may not have the same amount of experience. So Mexico can be hit and miss, I think is fair. There's some terrific guides there, but you can also run into problems there. And it's usually just a language issue. It's not that they're not passionate or they don't like what they're doing. It's generally what it comes down to is communication and their inability to communicate with you. Now, if you speak Spanish, you're set. But if you don't speak Spanish, it can be tricky. And I deal with a lot of high-end lodges in Mexico where I've said to the owner, you need to send all these guys to English class. And one of them actually looked at me and laughed, and he said, we tried, and then none of them showed up the first day. So, what can you do? But I wanted to be very upfront about that, because Mexico is the one country where over the course of 20 years, I'd say that's the area or the country that I've had the most difficulty with guiding. And again, 99% of it is just lack of communication. So the next thing I want to get into is gear. I think this is an important topic because I get a lot of questions about it, even from guys that have done 5 or 6 trips to the Caribbean. It's to me, without question, when you're getting into gear for a saltwater trip to the Caribbean, without question, the reel is the most important piece of your equipment. If you don't have a lot of money to spend on equipment, spend the money on your reel. Buy a good reel. And if that means maybe saving a little money on a less expensive rod, then for saltwater, that's definitely the way you got to go. I would argue that the reel is by far the most important piece of your equipment. Spend your money there. Don't cheap out on a reel. Chris can help you for sure, or any good fly shop, but that's your number one piece of equipment for any saltwater trip to the Caribbean. Yeah, was that something you wanted to say, Chris?
No, I 100% agree with that for sure. And you know, probably the line to an extent as well. But yeah, rod, it's kind of opposite of freshwater fishing, taking a little bit of a back seat there, I would say.
Yeah. Agreed. So in terms of rods, you know, you're definitely going to need an 8 weight, and I would say a 9 and a 10 weight. Minimum 2 rods. I would always say bring 3 rods on a Caribbean trip, because you're probably going to, there's a good chance you'll bust one. And if you break your bonefish rod, then what? So when I travel, I have an 8, a 9, and a 10. The 8 is for bonefish. The 9 is for permit, and the 10 is with a wire trace for barracudas, which I love to fish for. And if I'm going in the spring and I'm going to an area that has big tarpon, which I like to do, I'm going to bring an 11 and a 12 weight. And because I'm a fishing lunatic, I bring a backup 12 weight too. So I generally will bring 5 to 6 rods with me. Now, I also understand that most of you guys aren't as insane as I am, and that, you know, that's probably a good thing. But for me, I love spending my money on fly fishing gear. I love good quality gear. That's another thing. Good quality gear, if you're going to spend, I'm a big believer in buying good gear. I've just seen so much. Saltwater is so hard on rods and reels. I've seen so many things break when they shouldn't. Cheap gear just doesn't last in saltwater. You can get away with it in freshwater for a little while anyways, but in saltwater, inexpensive, and there's lots of good inexpensive gear these days, but cheap gear is not going to last, and it's going to let you down in the Caribbean. So I'm a big believer in spending money on rods, reels, especially reels. One interesting factor that you got to consider too is that most of your saltwater fishing in the Caribbean is going to be using weight forward floating lines. Generally speaking, you're going to be fishing anywhere, it doesn't matter where in the Caribbean you are, you're going to be fishing in between 18 inches and about 6 feet of water for most of your trip. So that is weight forward floating lines. I always recommend for the Caribbean, bring an intermediate sinking line just in case, or a full sink tip just in case, because that can be the difference between a great day and a crap day. But most of the time, you're going to be using weight forward floating lines. And that's, they're fairly simple to cast once you have the dynamics of casting down. So weight forward floating lines, polarized glasses. Again, a lot of guys do freshwater, think they don't need them, but for flats fishing in the Caribbean, you've got to have good polarized glasses. There's 3 places where I say spend money: fishing reels, good polarized glasses, and a good raincoat. That's a key. Raincoats are really important. Even if even if it's a bluebird day, you should always bring a raincoat when you're on the flats. You just never know. The coldest I've ever been in my life was in southern Belize in mid-January. We went out on a beautiful, warm, sunny day. 3 hours later, it started raining. We had to pull into a mangrove forest and hide as best we could. Neither my guide nor I brought a raincoat that day. And I sat in the rain with nowhere to hide for 4 solid hours. I was borderline hypothermic by the time we got back to the mainland. And so you got to have a raincoat. It's really important. You're going to need a good waterproof dry bag for your raincoat, for your camera, for your water bottle. Um, just general good flats clothing, light breathable clothing is highly recommended. Quick dry, Sims, Patagonia, really good materials, smart, they look good. So that's it as far as gear goes. Just generally, bonefish are simple, 8 weights, permits are 9 and 10. It really also depends on how competent an angler you are. I do a lot of saltwater fishing, so I generally bonefish with a 6 weight. I've got a good reel that holds about 250 yards of backing. And if it's not windy, I'm going to go with a 6 weight. But I've also been fishing in saltwater for 20 plus years, and I'm pretty decent at it. So I don't recommend a 6 weight for guys that don't have a lot of experience. For sure, an 8 weight is a good all around. A good 8 weight is a good all around rod for multi species in the ocean and on the flats, but certainly for bonefish. I mean, I've caught 40-pound tarpon on an 8 weight. I've caught 15, 20-pound jacks on an 8 weight. So an 8 weight's a good rod. You got to have an 8 weight on any saltwater trip to Caribbean. Permit, yep. Sorry, I thought somebody was jumping in.
Sorry, no, you might have heard me typing. I was just getting back to a question.
Oh,
I just not sure if you're going to touch on it as well, but if anyone hasn't been down before, probably important to just note quickly the difference in line types as well, and that you have to have a tropical fly line when you're headed down there. Just like kind of like summer and winter tires, they're made with harder plastics for the tropical heat. And I've seen freshwater lines, and people struggle with freshwater lines in the heat. They just don't work. They get beat up and they don't turn over. And definitely want to make sure you have the right line there.
100% agree. I've watched lines just peeling off the core, and because they're not designed for the heat and the salt. So that's a good point. I wouldn't have thought of that to mention that, but could not agree more.
Yeah, it actually might not even be a worth or a bad idea. You mentioned bringing a spare rod, but a spare line, depending on where you're going. I've had it. I mean, people talk about bringing spare lines for things like GTs and giant saltwater species, but I've had them just get wrapped up on a hitch or a bolt on the boat before and get cut too. So if you're really serious about doing some crazy remote once in a lifetime trip, just having a spare line with you might not be the worst idea.
Could not agree more. And I that is for species like GTs. I have guys right now that are in the Seychelles at Astove that are specifically targeting GTs. You can't go there without bringing spare lines, because coral bust offs are commonplace there. And you're in the middle of nowhere. What do you do if you lose a couple of fly lines? You're done, right? You've got to have spares. Not quite the same extent of threat to break a line in the salt in the Caribbean, but certainly in a lot of places like Cuba, where you have to bring everything you're going to plan to use, a spare line is a really solid idea. So I just wanted to give a quick overview, touch on some key points for fishing in the Caribbean. I mean, it's a huge topic in and of itself. I can just speak to you for an hour on just fishing in Andros, which is the largest island in the Bahamas. But I just wanted to give an overview of the Caribbean and what you can expect there. I think the last thing I just want to touch on which is a really important factor to any decision you make for where you would like to go, is going to be your budget. And essentially what you're looking at in Belize, which is probably one of the better value locations, for a week you can get there. You can do a week for anywhere from, depending on where you stay, about $4,000 to about $5,700 US for a week. And that will include your guiding, your accommodations, your food, in some cases alcohol. but Belize, you're looking at maximum about $5,700 for a week.
Yeah, which really isn't bad when you kind of step back and realize that, you know, if your typical guiding rate for somebody is, you know, $500 or whatever it is for, you know, 5-6 days of fishing, and then you realize the accommodations in there, like, it starts to make sense pretty quickly, really.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And certainly a lot of the guiding, like the better freelance guides in places like Mexico and the Bahamas, it's more than 500 a day now. Prices, like everything, have gone up in the last 6 months because a lot of it has to do with fuel, right? So if a guide is burning fuel, his rate has gone up, and he's going to be burning fuel every day he's fishing with you. And it's the same with the lodges. Lodges have gotten more expensive, like everything else, and it's mostly because of fuel costs. Because a lot of these places are in remote places, remote areas where, you know, it's hard to get fuel in. So that's Belize as far as price point. Bahamas has a much wider variation. I think my least expensive property in the Bahamas is just under 4,000. So I think it's about $3,800 for a week. But you know, I've got properties where you're going to be spending for a full week, if you want and you're willing to do it, close to $9,000 US for a week. So there's a huge range in between there because there's a lot of different lodges in the Bahamas. I don't represent all of them. I represent the ones that I like and think bring value to clients, and not just monetarily, but value through service, experience, uniqueness of the property. There's a lot of factors that go into how I look at a lodge and decide whether or not I want to represent it. Cost certainly is probably way down on the list of important factors for me. So then I want to talk about price points in Mexico. Again, you've got a pretty wide range, but it's not as distinct as, say, the Bahamas. So Mexico, your least expensive property, I think, is about $3,800, and you can go up to the most expensive fishery is Playa Blanca Lodge, and I think for a double occupancy rate right now, it's about $6,000. So you're looking at, you know, close to 4 to around 6 USD. Now we get into Cuba. This is the widest variation. You've got, for a full week in the Zapata now at Salinas, is with your own guide and skiff, is about $5,000. But the upper echelon Avalon trips, depending on which boat you go on, you're looking at $10,000 to $11,000 on the high end for what they offer. They also have trips in the $7,000 range, in the $6,000 range. But the liveaboards that Cuba and the south coast of Cuba is famous for, you know, liveaboards are expensive. And I could just do a seminar on liveaboard fishing, because that, without question, is my favorite way to fish an area. And Cuba does it very well. Avalon does a really good job. Where they operate is very difficult, and their prices are, you know, reflect that, especially their more high-end boats. So, you know, where you go should be depending on what you're interested in, the type of time frame that you can go, because you can't travel whenever you want. Some people can, but not everybody has that luxury. You want to be looking at price points, and most importantly is, what species are you interested in checking out? What species are you interested in chasing? That, to me, is really the first thing I need to know when I'm going to set somebody up at a facility. Because what I do is I ask a series of questions that really give me a good understanding and idea of what your experience level is, what you're interested in fishing for, what your hopes for the trip are. And when I know those things, it eliminates so many places, and I'm able to just drill down into the right fit, where you should be, when you should be there. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I love my job. I said to a client today, I said, I've got the best job in the world, and I really believe I do, because I get to do this full time. So that's it. If you have any questions, anything specific, again, I've just tried to give a really general overview because this is a large topic. And I could sit here for 10 hours and still not do it justice. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Just let me know how I can help.
That's terrific. That was a really thorough presentation. I'm sure I could think of 10 or more questions to ask you off the top of my head, but probably best to like say end it there. And if anyone has more specific questions, let them get in touch. You didn't have it on here, but if anyone wanted to reach out to you, had any questions, how would they do that?
Just find me on my website at slipstreamangling.com. My phone number, email is all there. I didn't brand myself today. I didn't put my logo up. I didn't wear a company hat for this presentation. I really just wanted to talk about the Caribbean and market the Caribbean. So if you don't book with me, that's okay. Just go, because it's a great experience. I think you'll enjoy it immensely, but I'd be delighted to help anybody in any way. Even if you just have a question, just fire me off an email at info@slipstreamangling.com and I'll respond, or just go to my website, which is slipstreamangling.com. And it's got all my portfolio of destinations there. I've got my travel blog, which is, I just got back from 5 weeks of fishing with clients in New Zealand. So my website's pretty good. It's pretty comprehensive. And if I can help with anything, I'd be delighted to.
Yeah, I'll say you do a great job on the site as well, sort of breaking down the destinations to an extent as well, talking about, kind of what to expect there. And I'd say it's all pretty bang on. And if I'm not mistaken, every destination that you list, you've fished at or have sent somebody to personally to have fished. Is that right?
That's 100% correct. I'd say I've been to 85% of them, but there are certain, like I'm lucky. But I can't be everywhere. And I have about 4, and I know I might get a bunch of resumes here, but I have about 4 retired clients that have fished with me for all of them for over a decade, who are all retired. And if I need someone to go somewhere and I can't go, I've got a handful of guys that go, and they basically have a list of questions from me that I need answered. And I would say 50% of the time they will go and say, forget it, don't bother. But the other 50% of the time, they're like, this is a really good facility. I really like lodges where the owner is on site. That's a big bonus for me. So when I know the owner's on site, I try to be there myself. But I run a lot of trips. I'm busy. But I've been to, I would say 85, maybe 90% of the destinations. The other 10%, I have had people that I know and trust and that have worked with me go there for me.
Yeah, that's awesome to know that you vet them to that extent. And like I say, we've had nothing but great experiences traveling with you. I should note again as well, I know you mentioned it off the top, but Richard does, for anyone looking abroad, do a lot of trips for other species and other destinations sort of all over the place. So you can check out his site there for what is offered. Richard, this has been really fun. Thanks again for coming on for this.
My pleasure to help. Just let me know if you need anything.